The night was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that made every rustle of leaves sound like a scream. In the small town of Willow Creek, the streetlights flickered as if hesitating to illuminate the shadows, and in those shadows, Edvard Eddie Moreno waited. Eddie wasn't an obvious threat. To the casual observer, he was a polite man in his mid-30s, dressed in neatly pressed slacks and a conservative shirt, his thick, dark hair combed with precision. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that suggested nothing more sinister than a man on his way home from work. Yet, behind his calm exterior, there was a mind that constantly calculated, assessed, and imagined. A mind that had long ago drawn lines between the people he admired and those he deemed expendable. Tonight, Eddie had been observing a local dance hall from across the street. The lights spilled golden over the parking lot, and through the windows he could see women laughing, couples swaying to the soft music, and the kind of carefree joy that made his stomach twist. One of them caught his eye, a young woman named Marcy Holloway, known in town for her kindness and her quiet charm. She was laughing at something her friends said, her head tilted slightly, hair brushing her shoulders in waves. In Eddie's distorted view, her innocence marked her as perfect for his first step into action. He waited until the crowd thinned, until Marcy stepped outside alone to get a breath of cold night air. The shadows stretched long as he followed her, keeping a careful distance, blending into the dim streetlights. Every step was deliberate, every heartbeat a drum that drove his anticipation higher. When they reached the small alley beside the bakery, Eddie moved with a precision that only years of observation and planning could create. In one swift motion, he struck, muffling the sound with a handkerchief pressed over her mouth. Marcy's eyes widened in shock, the world narrowing to the terror of that single moment. And then, it was over. Eddie dragged her body into the darkness, leaving no trace for anyone to stumble upon just yet. Back in his modest apartment, Eddie cleaned his hands meticulously, catalogued the night's actions in his mental ledger, and carefully placed Marcy's scarf into a hidden compartment in his closet. A trophy, a proof, a reminder. It was not about rage or passion or impulse. It was about control, about the precision of his mind executing what the world had failed to do. Remove the weak, preserve the pattern he so carefully constructed in his head. By dawn, Willow Creek would wake to the shocking news. A young woman had vanished, leaving no clues, no struggle visible to the eyes of law enforcement. The town would murmur, neighbors would speculate, but Eddie would already be planning his next observation, his next choice. Because this wasn't a one-time act. It was the opening move in a game he had been rehearsing silently for years. Eddie's story, like the night, was just beginning, and as the town slept, oblivious, he smiled faintly to himself, the kind of smile that spoke of secrets only he understood. The first light of dawn cast a pale gray over Willow Creek, revealing the quiet streets and shuttered windows of a town that still had no idea the darkness creeping through it. Eddie Moreno sat by his kitchen window, sipping black coffee, his gaze calm but sharp, tracing the early movements of the townspeople like a hawk. The news of Marcy Holloway's disappearance had spread quickly, but nobody suspected that the carefully composed man they greeted on Main Street could be the orchestrator of such horror. Eddie's mind was already several steps ahead. One act was not enough. He needed patterns, experiments, to understand the limits of his control. 2 weeks after Marcy, he found his next victim, Lillian Crosby, a librarian who lived alone at the edge of town. Eddie observed her routine for days, the precise moment she unlocked her front door, the way she arranged books in her small living room, even the manner in which she watered the tiny fern on her windowsill. Every detail mattered. On a rainy Thursday evening, Eddie struck. The alley behind the library offered enough cover to approach without detection. Lillian's eyes widened in disbelief, and Eddie moved with a detached precision, restraining her long enough to complete his act. By the time she was gone, the rain had washed away most evidence. No footprints, no struggle, just the faint scent of the city mixed with the wet earth. Eddie returned home, meticulous as always, wrapping Lillian's glasses in cloth and placing them alongside Marcy's scarf. But unlike the first time, Eddie felt a twinge of urgency, a rush of adrenaline that he hadn't fully anticipated. The risk was increasing, and with each act, the invisible threads of law enforcement started to brush against him. The town's police chief, Harold Simmons, a man with decades of experience in handling thefts and bar fights, now faced something far more insidious. He had noticed the commonality. All victims were women of a certain type, quiet, independent, unassuming, and all vanished in small windows of opportunity. He spoke cautiously to his deputies, aware of the fear spreading through Willow Creek. These aren't random disappearances. Someone's planning this. Someone knows exactly what they're doing. Meanwhile, Eddie was already observing his third intended victim, a young woman named Claire Whitman, who worked in a flower shop downtown. He noted how she carried bouquets out to waiting customers, her gestures delicate, her presence almost ethereal in the warm glow of the shop's lamps. Eddie's fascination was not sexual. It was the perfection of her routine, the vulnerability in her trust of a world she believed was safe. That night, Eddie followed her home through twisting streets and narrow alleys. He had refined his approach. Minimal noise, no witnesses, no rushed mistakes. The attack was swift, almost clinical. But this time, Eddie felt the tension stretch taut in his chest, the city's latent watchfulness pressing against him. Claire struggled, leaving faint scratches on his arm, but Eddie maintained control. He left her scarf in a folded pattern in his apartment, noting in his mind that it was different from the previous two, an experiment in personal cataloging. The next morning, police were confronted with a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Claire's disappearance mirrored Marcy and Lillian's with unnerving precision. Chief Simmons now faced mounting pressure from city officials and anxious townspeople demanding answers. He began mapping the disappearances. 3 small clusters over 2 months, each in quiet neighborhoods, each victim a woman of modest means and gentle demeanor. "We're dealing with someone intelligent," Simmons said during a meeting with his officers, tapping a map with careful fingers. "Not a random predator, someone who plans this, someone patient, methodical. They're hunting." But Eddie, sitting in his apartment miles away, felt the thrill of the chase. Law enforcement was closing in, perhaps, but he saw every movement they made as part of a grand game. Each clue they discovered, each assumption they made, he could anticipate. The town slept unaware, while Eddie quietly catalogued the missing women, each item, a scarf, a pair of glasses, a folded note, marking his control over lives that had once seemed ordinary and safe. The tension was building. Eddie's precision made him confident, almost untouchable. But as the police intensified their investigation, the thin veil of normalcy in Willow Creek began to tear. And Eddie knew it. One mistake, one careless moment, could bring his careful world crashing down. Yet, in his mind, the pattern was flawless, his control absolute, and the next target already moved in the shadows of his careful calculations. The air in the small town of Cedar Hollow was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and damp earth. In the cozy glow of the Golden Lily Salon, 2 sisters, Sophia and Laurel Montgomery, swept the polished wooden floors with synchronized movements, their chatter light, almost teasing. To any outsider, they were simply cheerful girls running a family business. But beneath the smiles, a darker calculus stirred, one that had been honed through years of shared secrets and whispered philosophies. Sophia, the elder by 3 years, had sharp gray eyes that seemed to see past surfaces into the very fabric of a person's character. Laurel, quieter and more introspective, carried a notebook where she sketched faces and jotted observations about the customers. how they walked, how they laughed, how they interacted with others. Their philosophy was simple. The world was cluttered with people who did nothing but occupy space, and they had the right, no, the duty, to remove those who failed to fulfill a certain self-imposed standard of worth. That day, a young woman named Margaret Ellis walked in for a haircut. She was polite, perhaps too polite, and radiated a certain nervous energy that immediately caught Sophia's attention. They exchanged small talk, Sophia's questions precise, almost surgical, probing subtly into Margaret's life and fears. Every answer Margaret gave was catalogued in Laurel's notebook, a quiet tally of traits the sisters would later evaluate. Later that evening, as Margaret stepped outside to get a breath of fresh air, the sisters followed her at a distance. Cedar Hollow streets were quiet, the way small towns are when the sun dips low and residents retreat to their homes. Sophia and Laurel moved with an uncanny coordination, almost a dance perfected over years of mutual understanding. When Margaret paused by the corner park, Laurel approached from behind while Sophia circled to the front, cutting off any chance of escape. Their attack was swift but calculated. Not a moment was wasted. The suffocating grip of planning enveloped them as Margaret's protests were silenced. By the time the neighbors noticed the absence of her usual return home, the sisters had already left the scene, leaving no immediate evidence behind. Back in the salon, Laurel flipped through her notebook, marking a check next to Margaret's name, while Sophia arranged the hairbrushes neatly in their holder. Neither spoke of what had just occurred, though the air between them was charged with the quiet exhilaration of shared purpose. To outsiders, they were harmless girls running a small-town salon. To themselves, they were arbiters of natural selection, refining the world one life at a time. The following day, Cedar Hollow awoke to the news of Margaret's disappearance. Rumors spread, and fear rippled quietly through the town's streets, but no one suspected the smiling sisters who continued their work as if nothing had happened. Police Chief Henry Caldwell noted the case in his growing stack of unsolved disappearances, but could not yet connect it to any larger pattern. Cedar Hollow, like so many other small towns, was ill-prepared for the subtle horror that had taken root among its friendly facades. Sophia and Laurel continued their routine, observing other potential candidates with the same careful scrutiny, always in tandem, always in perfect coordination. Each day their plan grew more precise, each decision more deliberate. For them, murder was not about rage or impulse. It was an art form, a meticulous act of judgment. And as the town slept peacefully, oblivious, the sisters prepared for their next move, already identifying the next unwitting soul who would become a part of their grim catalog. Cedar Hollow woke slowly that morning, mist curling along the quiet streets like a ghostly veil. Sophia and Laurel Montgomery moved through the town with their usual composure, their hands busy with the salon's chores, their faces radiating the same cheerful warmth that made them beloved by locals. Yet beneath that familiar veneer, the sisters were calculating, plotting, identifying their next victims with precision. 2 weeks after Margaret Ellis disappeared, their attention turned to Helen Mercer, the owner of a small bakery on the town's main street. Helen was a woman of meticulous habits, who took pride in her pastries and spent her evenings meticulously arranging flowers in her shop window. To the sisters, Helen represented the same complacency and mediocrity they had eliminated before. A life too ordinary, a soul untested. They followed her routines carefully, observing when she would leave the bakery unattended, noting the delivery truck's schedules, the neighbors' habits. On a Thursday evening, Laurel distracted Helen by pretending to be a curious customer, asking about bread recipes, while Sophia moved behind her, swift and precise. The attack was brief, executed with the efficiency that only years of careful coordination could produce. Helen's disappearance sent ripples of fear through Cedar Hollow. The town had begun to whisper of a pattern, though Chief Henry Caldwell still lacked concrete evidence. The sisters didn't stop there. Their next target was Alice Thornton, a quiet schoolteacher known for her strict rules and orderly life. Sophia and Laurel watched her for days, cataloging her habits and planning every detail of their approach. On a rainy night, they struck again. Alice was lured into a secluded path by the promise of helping Sophia with a minor errand. There, the sisters' synchronization was flawless. Laurel blocked the path. Sophia incapacitated Alice quickly, and within minutes, the act was complete.
As Cedar Hollow's townspeople grew anxious, the police began to notice an unusual pattern.
Chief Caldwell, already juggling the mystery of Margaret Ellis, now had 2 more disappearances to add to his records. The townsfolk were terrified, speculation ran rampant, and rumors about a possible predator in the area began to circulate. But despite the increasing tension, the sisters maintained their daily routines, their cheerful smiles masking the grim reality of their deeds. What troubled Caldwell most was the lack of physical evidence. Unlike other crimes he had investigated over his decades of service, these incidents left no discernible trace. No footprints, no witnesses, no apparent motive. Only a vague sense of malevolence permeated the town, a darkness that seemed to come from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. Yet the sisters were not entirely careless. In Laurel's notebook, the sketches of their victims were becoming more detailed, notes about habits, reactions, and vulnerabilities meticulously recorded. These were not just crimes, they were experiments, and each successful act was proof of their growing mastery over life and death. By the time the 3rd disappearance was reported, Cedar Hollow was gripped by fear. Parents kept their children home, shopkeepers double-locked their doors, and whispers filled the narrow streets. Chief Caldwell convened a meeting with his officers, trying to map the connections between the missing women. All young, all quiet, all without obvious enemies. Yet the pieces did not fit neatly. There were no signs of struggle, no demands, no ransom. Only the empty spaces left behind by lives abruptly stolen. Meanwhile, Sophia and Laurel continued their surveillance, already identifying new victims. Each new plan was more daring than the last, executed with the same meticulous care. Their sense of invincibility grew as the police struggled to find even a hint of evidence linking them to the disappearances. Cedar Hollow, a town that once felt safe, now lived under a shadow, one cast by the very people it trusted most. The sisters' reign of terror was quietly expanding, and as the town's tension mounted, the first threads of suspicion began to emerge, not yet strong enough to catch them, but enough to suggest that the peaceful streets of Cedar Hollow were no longer what they seemed. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Maplewood, a small town where everyone knew everyone else. In the quaint Bennett residence at the edge of town, a couple sat in their living room, sipping tea with a deliberate calm. Henry Bennett, tall and gaunt, spoke with a slow precision, his dark eyes scanning the room as if analyzing every detail. Beside him, his wife, Clara Bennett, petite and seemingly fragile, twirled a strand of her dark hair around her finger, her expression serene, but with a tension that belied the quiet domesticity. To outsiders, they were just another married couple living quietly in Maplewood. But within their home, a darker rhythm governed their lives. Henry and Clara shared a philosophy that blurred lines between morality and personal code. Life was fragile, human nature was corrupt, and those who failed to meet their standards were disposable. Unlike the sisters in Cedar Hollow or Eddie Moreno, their method was collaborative, each bringing complementary traits to their grim work. Henry was meticulous, calculating, and methodical. Clara was impulsive, emotional, yet surprisingly cunning when guided by Henry's planning. Together, they were a seamless, deadly partnership. Their first target was Mr. Thomas Kersey, a neighbor who had recently grown suspicious of strange noises coming from the Bennetts' property. Thomas had a confrontational streak and had threatened to alert the town council if the oddities continued. To Henry and Clara, he was a threat to their carefully controlled world. They spent days observing him, noting the patterns in his daily routines, his walks in the early morning, the times he fetched his mail, the moments he lingered by his garden fence. On a crisp Thursday evening, they struck. Henry lured Thomas into a secluded section of their backyard under the pretense of discussing a neighborhood concern, while Clara intercepted any passers-by, ensuring no witness would intrude. The attack was swift and coordinated. Henry immobilized Thomas with mechanical precision, while Clara acted as an accomplice, applying sudden, shocking force that left no room for resistance. By the time the deed was done, they had removed every trace of their presence, leaving the scene seemingly untouched, except for subtle signs only the keenest observer might notice. Back inside their home, Henry meticulously catalogued the evening in his journal, detailing every action, every movement, every minor adjustment. Clara, meanwhile, prepared their kitchen as if nothing had occurred, her hands steady, her composure unshaken. The duality of their personalities, one methodical, one impulsive, made them both unpredictable and frighteningly efficient. The following day, Maplewood awoke to the news that Thomas Kersey had disappeared. The town was baffled. There were no signs of a struggle, no motive, no leads. Local authorities, accustomed to minor thefts or domestic quarrels, had little idea how to proceed. For Henry and Clara, the event was not only a success, but a confirmation of their unique synergy. Together, they could manipulate, control, and execute with a chilling effectiveness. As weeks passed, the Bennetts refined their methods. Henry's attention to detail ensured minimal mistakes, while Clara's willingness to act impulsively allowed them to capitalize on unforeseen opportunities. Unlike other killers who operated alone, the Bennetts thrived on their partnership, turning what could have been chaos into a meticulously choreographed sequence of events. By the time Maplewood police began connecting dots among recent disappearances, the Bennetts were already planning their next move, their confidence growing with every unnoticed crime. In the quiet of their home, they sat together, plotting, discussing, and refining, a team united by blood, by choice, and by a shared, dark vision of order in a chaotic world. The small towns of Willow Creek, Cedar Hollow, and Maplewood, though miles apart, were suddenly linked by a pattern the local police could barely comprehend. Chief Harold Simmons of Willow Creek, Chief Henry Caldwell of Cedar Hollow, and Maplewood's Lieutenant George Harper had each been tracking their own disappearances. None suspected that the darkness threading through their towns was far more sinister and interconnected by sheer coincidence, a coincidence that could easily have gone unnoticed. In Willow Creek, Simmons stared at the sparse evidence from Eddie Moreno's killings: a scarf, a pair of glasses, a faint pattern in the locations of the disappearances. "It's like he's toying with us," Simmons muttered to his deputy, tracing a map with careful fingers. 3 women, gone within 2 months, and nothing to go on. It's almost precise. Meanwhile, Cedar Hollow's Caldwell faced a mounting sense of dread. Margaret Ellis, Helen Mercer, and Alice Thornton had vanished without a trace, leaving only Laurel Montgomery's subtle notes, hidden from the world, of each woman's personality, habits, and vulnerabilities. Caldwell had begun noticing the psychological subtleties. These weren't random abductions. The perpetrator, or perpetrators, had a selective, almost philosophical rationale. Maplewood's Harper, dealing with Thomas Kersey's disappearance, saw a different pattern: signs of collaboration. The scene suggested more than one person, and subtle traces of planning indicated a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Harper couldn't yet identify the Bennetts, but intuition told him that a single killer wasn't responsible. Eddie Moreno, meanwhile, felt the faint press of law enforcement closing in. He had left one subtle clue at his third crime scene: Claire Whitman's scarf, folded in a peculiar way, meant to catalog her uniquely. A rookie officer had noticed the strange arrangement when dusting for prints: filing it in the evidence locker, unaware that it was Eddie's calling card. Eddie sensed the possibility of discovery, but his confidence remained high. He considered it a challenge rather than a threat. In Cedar Hollow, Sophia and Laurel maintained their routine, but subtle tension grew between them and the townspeople. An anonymous neighbor had reported seeing the sisters lingering near Alice Thornton's house the night she disappeared. It was vague, circumstantial, but Caldwell noted it. The first thread of suspicion, though fragile, had begun to form. In Maplewood, the Bennetts' careful planning left tiny, almost invisible clues. A fingerprint smudge, a faint mud trail, a misplaced object near Thomas Kersey's home. Harper began compiling a list of anomalies, each seemingly trivial but collectively forming a disturbing pattern. The Bennetts, aware of the heightened scrutiny, subtly shifted their routines, testing the patience and perception of law enforcement. Across the three towns, tension mounted. The communities, once secure in their small-town routines, now whispered about strangers, about shadows, about the inexplicable vanishings. Each detective realized the scale of the challenge. They were dealing not with ordinary criminals, but with meticulous, intelligent killers who carefully curated their prey. As the first investigative threads emerged, the killers themselves were not idle. Eddie cataloged his victims with meticulous care, noting psychological traits and vulnerabilities. Sophia and Laurel refined their selection criteria, always observing, always measuring. The Bennetts adapted, combining Henry's methodical precision with Clara's impulsive flair to evade detection. Each act, each observation, was both a continuation of their pattern and a test of law enforcement's limits. The stakes were rising. Police were beginning to see patterns, to connect dots across neighborhoods, yet no one could yet perceive the full scope of the horror. And somewhere, in the quiet of their homes or apartments, the killers watched, planned, and waited. In that delicate balance, the first threads of discovery had been spun. The evidence, the suspicions, the anomalies, all pointed to something far more organized than any town official had imagined. And yet for the killers, it was merely the beginning of a dangerous, intoxicating game, to see if they could stay one step ahead until the inevitable confrontation drew near. The small towns of Willow Creek, Cedar Hollow, and Maplewood were no longer simply sleepy communities. Fear had begun to seep into the daily lives of residents, leaving subtle tension in conversations, wary glances down empty streets, and homes bolted tightly against imagined threats. For Eddie Moreno, Sophia and Laurel Montgomery, and the Bennetts, this fear was both a challenge and a thrill, a reflection of how closely law enforcement had begun to encroach on their carefully constructed worlds. In Willow Creek, Eddie was planning his fourth victim, a young man named Samuel Pierce, who worked at the local hardware store. Eddie's obsession with precision had evolved. He was now cataloging traits beyond gender and appearance, studying personality and habitual reactions to stress. Samuel, calm and predictable, became the perfect subject for his psychological experiment. But Eddie's confidence was tested that evening when he was briefly spotted by a neighbor as he moved through a narrow alley. The moment passed, unnoticed, yet a subtle flicker of unease passed through him. The thrill of the chase intensified, the stakes suddenly higher. Meanwhile, in Cedar Hollow, the Montgomery sisters targeted their fourth victim, young Eva Donovan, a school librarian whose quiet diligence mirrored that of their earlier victims. The sisters' coordination was seamless. Sophia lured Eva into a quiet side street under a pretext, while Laurel blocked potential observers. Yet for the first time, a subtle miscalculation occurred. A passing pedestrian noticed the sisters' presence lingering too long near Eva's intended route. It was only a brief glance, almost insignificant, but in the world of the Montgomerys, even a minor flaw could ripple into danger. In Maplewood, the Bennetts prepared their second crime, a carefully orchestrated abduction of a woman named Gloria Finch, a local shop assistant who had been inadvertently probing into their activities after noticing unusual noises in their home. Henry had laid out the plan with painstaking precision, while Clara acted with her usual calm impulsiveness. But as they executed the plan, they left a single, almost imperceptible trace. A small scrap of paper from Henry's planning journal, fluttering beneath a bush near the crime scene. Across all 3 towns, law enforcement began connecting seemingly unrelated dots. Willow Creek's Chief Simmons noticed a pattern in Eddie's victims. Small items left behind, subtle signs of careful staging. Cedar Hollow's Caldwell began mapping the Montgomerys' disappearances, noting the unusual coordination and timing. Maplewood's Harper found a peculiar scrap of paper near Gloria Finch's last known location. Each officer, in isolation, saw only fragments. Yet together, a picture of methodical, intelligent killers was starting to emerge. The tension reached its peak when Eddie, unaware of the increased scrutiny, attempted another abduction. Samuel Pierce resisted in a way Eddie had not fully anticipated, leaving minor scratches that could potentially identify the attacker. Eddie retreated, noting the anomaly in his mental ledger, an irritation that also excited him. Sophia and Laurel, too, experienced the first pangs of fear. Their careful choreography had been slightly observed. Though they escaped direct detection, the realization that they were no longer invisible began to settle into their minds. And the Bennetts, for the first time, faced a near disaster. The fluttering scrap of Henry's journal was retrieved by Harper's junior officer, a clue that could unravel months of meticulously hidden crimes. Henry noticed the potential exposure too late, forcing the couple to adapt quickly, their usual confidence shaken. For the first time, the killers all understood that they were being watched, that their patterns were not as invisible as they had assumed. The thrill, the control, the cold logic of their actions had led them to this precipice, the fine line between dominance and capture. The 3 towns, now aware of an invisible predator, or perhaps multiple predators, began tightening their networks of vigilance. Residents looked over shoulders, police patrolled with renewed urgency, and the calm illusion of safety was permanently shattered. For Eddie, the Montgomery sisters, and the Bennetts, the stakes had never been higher. One misstep could unravel everything. One piece of evidence could connect the dots, and law enforcement's net was slowly tightening around them. The game was no longer theoretical. It was urgent, dangerous, and unsparing. The autumn nights had grown colder, and the streets of Willow Creek, Cedar Hollow, and Maplewood were shrouded in a tension that felt almost tangible. Months of disappearances, unanswered questions, and growing paranoia had reached a tipping point. For the first time, the investigators were on the cusp of a breakthrough. In Willow Creek, Chief Harold Simmons was poring over every detail of Eddie Moreno's victims. The folded scarf of Claire Whitman, the glasses of Lillian Crosby, the root patterns. They were not random. One detail in particular caught Simmons' attention: small scuff marks on the alley pavement near Claire's last known location. Using witness statements and careful timing, he began narrowing down the window of opportunity. Simmons suspected the perpetrator lived nearby, someone who understood the town intimately. Eddie, meanwhile, continued his routine, unaware that the investigation was closing in. That night, as he stalked another potential victim, Simmons and 2 deputies quietly observed the alley. Their patience paid off. Eddie appeared, calm and composed, following the pattern they had anticipated. The officers moved with precision, surrounding him before he could react. Eddie's shock was almost imperceptible. For the first time, he realized that his control had limits. Back at the station, the search of Eddie's modest apartment revealed horrifying confirmation of Simmons' suspicions. A hidden compartment behind his closet contained Claire Whitman's scarf, Marcy Holloway's belongings, and Lillian Crosby's glasses, all meticulously catalogued. Every item told a story, every trophy was proof of his crimes. The evidence was irrefutable. Simmons had caught a meticulous predator, a man whose precision and intelligence had allowed him to evade detection for months. Meanwhile, Cedar Hollow's Chief Caldwell intensified surveillance on Sophia and Laurel Montgomery. Anonymous tips, coupled with careful observation of the sisters' routines, led officers to stake out the area near the local library, where Eva Donovan had last been seen. Cameras captured suspicious behavior, the sisters loitering, whispering, and noting the comings and goings of residents. The first pieces of tangible evidence, a photograph of Laurel near Eva's house at the time of her disappearance, gave Caldwell probable cause to interrogate them. In Maplewood, Lieutenant George Harper's junior officer returned the scrap of Henry Bennett's planning journal. Harper immediately recognized its significance. Notes on timing, potential victims, and contingency plans were detailed with alarming clarity. A stakeout at the Bennetts' home ensued. Surveillance captured Clara and Henry moving in coordinated patterns, testing the neighborhood in a way that mirrored the abduction plan for Gloria Finch. The Bennetts' overconfidence and the trace evidence finally provided the officers with the break they needed. As Eddie Moreno awaited trial in Willow Creek, the sisters and the Bennetts remained under heavy surveillance, each step monitored, each interaction scrutinized. The stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move could lead to arrest, and the threads of their meticulous planning were beginning to unravel. For the first time, the law had a concrete handle on the perpetrators. Evidence was being gathered, timelines reconstructed, and witness statements corroborated. Items from crime scenes were cataloged, analyzed, and matched to suspects. The hunters had become the hunted, and the towns began to breathe, albeit cautiously, knowing the predators were no longer invisible. The psychological tension was immense. Each suspect, Eddie, the Montgomery sisters, and the Bennetts, was confronted with the reality of being observed, of their careful systems being dismantled piece by piece. The next phase of justice was inevitable. Collection of irrefutable evidence, formal charges, and the march toward trial. By the end of this phase, Eddie Moreno had been captured and secured, his trophies documented as critical evidence. The Montgomery sisters were under constant surveillance, while the Bennetts' home had become a fortress of observation for Maplewood law enforcement. For the first time, the towns were united by a shared relief. The nightmare was being contained, and the intricate webs of the killers were beginning to unravel. The courthouse in Willow Creek was packed to the brim. Local residents, journalists from neighboring towns, and law enforcement officers filled the wooden benches, each buzzing with anticipation. Months of fear, disappearances, and speculation had culminated in this moment. The trial of Edward Moreno, whose meticulously concealed crimes had shocked an entire community. Edward sat in the defendant's chair, impeccably dressed, calm but with a faint tension in his gray eyes. Chief Harold Simmons had prepared a detailed presentation of the evidence. Claire Whitman's scarf folded in precise patterns, Marcy Holloway's glasses, Lillian Crosby's belongings, and eyewitness accounts mapping Eddie's movements. Each exhibit was meticulously catalogued and presented to the jury. The room fell silent as Simmons recounted the timeline, revealing not just the acts of murder, but Eddie's disturbing, methodical mindset. "Your Honor," Simmons said, holding up a small, folded piece of fabric. "This was found hidden in the defendant's apartment. It belonged to Claire Whitman. Mr. Moreno catalogued it meticulously, keeping trophies from his victims as reminders of his control over their lives." The jury shivered as they observed the items laid out on a table. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by obsession and cold calculation, who had manipulated every opportunity to strike undetected. Edward's defense attorney attempted to argue temporary psychological disturbance, but the overwhelming evidence left little room for doubt. Meanwhile, in Cedar Hollow and Maplewood, similar processes were underway. Sophia and Laurel Montgomery were arraigned together, their calm exteriors belying the mounting tension as officers presented photographs, witness statements, and Laurel's meticulous notebook documenting the selection and habits of their victims. The courtroom audience murmured at the revelation of the sisters' twisted philosophy, removing those they deemed unworthy as an act of natural curation. In Maplewood, the Bennetts faced their trial with a mix of defiance and meticulous calculation. The scrap of Henry Bennett's journal, combined with surveillance footage and small but critical physical evidence, left no doubt of their complicity. Witnesses testified to their coordinated actions and the timing of abductions, building a compelling narrative of deliberate, planned killings. Harper's team had ensured every detail, every nuance of the couple's methodical crimes was presented with precision. Across all three trials, the psychological impact was profound. Families of victims wept quietly, townsfolk whispered in disbelief, and the press scrambled to report on the intelligence and cruelty behind seemingly ordinary facades. The killer's manipulations, once hidden in plain sight, were now fully exposed. The trophies, the coordination, the obsession with control, and the philosophy that justified their murders. Verdicts came swiftly. Edward Moreno was found guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. Sophia and Laurel Montgomery were convicted jointly for multiple counts of abduction and murder, their sentence reflecting the terrifying collaboration between the sisters. Henry and Clara Bennett were convicted for their series of murders and abductions, the court emphasizing the unique danger of their partnership, combining calculation and impulsivity. Sentences were pronounced, death by execution for all perpetrators. The rulings reflected not only the severity of the crimes, but the meticulous premeditation, the cold rationality, and the psychological torment imposed on innocent lives. As the gavel fell in each courtroom, the towns breathed a collective sigh of relief. Months of fear, uncertainty, and subtle terror had culminated in justice. Yet the chilling reality remained. The perpetrators had been ordinary faces in ordinary towns, hiding horrors behind smiles, routines, and domestic normalcy. The trial served as both closure and a grim reminder. Evil often wears a familiar face, and meticulous planning can mask the most brutal intentions. In small towns like Willow Creek, Cedar Hollow, and Maplewood, life would slowly return to routine, but the memory of the killer's intelligence, cruelty, and meticulous nature lingered like a shadow over quiet streets. The first snow of winter blanketed Willow Creek, Cedar Hollow, and Maplewood, softening the sharp edges of streets that had once been marked by fear. The small towns seemed quieter, calmer, yet beneath the fresh white layer, the memory of the months of terror lingered like an invisible scar. Life had returned to routine, but the shadow of the killer's actions remained etched in the minds of everyone who had lived through it. In Willow Creek, residents cautiously reopened their doors, spoke in hushed tones about the months of disappearances, and shared stories of Edward Moreno's meticulous and horrifying crimes. Children had grown wary of dark alleys, and adults still glanced over their shoulders, remembering the man whose ordinary face had concealed extraordinary cruelty. Chief Harold Simmons, hailed for his patience and attention to detail, continued to check in on the community, quietly ensuring that the sense of safety restored was lasting. Cedar Hollow, meanwhile, bore the weight of the Montgomery sisters' crimes. Sophia and Laurel had seemed like harmless, cheerful girls running a local salon. Now the town understood the terrifying intelligence and shared philosophy that had allowed them to manipulate, observe, and kill. The librarian who had once noticed small oddities in Eva Donovan's routine now lectured the town on vigilance, noting how close the sisters had come to evading detection entirely. The town slowly returned to normal, but an undercurrent of unease lingered, a reminder that danger sometimes hides behind smiles. Maplewood's residents faced the unsettling reality of the Bennetts' partnership. Henry and Clara had turned domestic life into a carefully orchestrated system of control and death. The community reflected on the quiet, neighborly exchanges, that had masked months of planning and violence.
Lieutenant George Harper documented the lessons learned for law enforcement: vigilance, observation, and never underestimating the calculated potential of seemingly ordinary citizens. For the families of the victims, closure came slowly. Funerals were held, memories shared, and therapy sessions attended. Yet the evidence and court proceedings, while legally sufficient, could never fully erase the trauma of knowing the killers had observed, judged, and executed their loved ones with cold precision. Psychologists later analyzed the three cases together, noting patterns in human behavior, manipulation, and collaborative crime. Eddie Moreno's obsession with control, the Montgomery sisters' synchronized philosophy of natural selection, and the Bennetts' marital synergy revealed different facets of the same terrifying truth. Intelligence and planning can be used to horrifying ends. The communities learned painfully that danger often exists not in the unknown, but in the familiar. Years later, as residents went about their lives, the memory of these crimes remained a cautionary tale. Children grew up with stories whispered about vigilance and trust, while local law enforcement integrated lessons from the cases into training for decades to come. The courts had delivered justice, yet the psychological ripples persisted. In the quiet of winter evenings, when snow muffled the streets and small towns appeared peaceful, a subtle unease reminded everyone that evil could be hidden in the most ordinary of places. Yet, alongside fear, there was relief. The predators had been stopped, meticulously hunted by law enforcement, and society had proven that even the most intelligent and methodical evil could be brought to justice. The towns were scarred, but they endured, and in that endurance lay a quiet triumph, a testament to vigilance, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth, no matter how deeply it is buried beneath ordinary faces. Please subscribe on my YouTube channel.